Good morning. Welcome to Books at the Bottom of the Stairs. My name's Lorene. I'm speaking to you today, not from the bottom of the stairs, but from in the studio. Last week's video was a bit chaotic, and this week there are multiple phone calls going on in different rooms. So different time zones for the different phone calls and stuff. So trying to carve out a space where I could fool around with my video was getting complicated. So I thought, fine, I'll do it in the studio. So there are lots of books around here. They're just off camera. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Nonfiction November, and I have two other books to talk about if there's time. I'm just looking at the clock so I cannot dribble on for too long. So Nonfiction Event is a booktube event that, if you don't know about it, is held every November, and it's hosted by Olive at Olive Books, which I will link in the description below. She has got a very good explanatory video as to what it's all about, and she has a team of people that are working with her on this. So I haven't quite figured out how to do, like, copying off of other people's blogs and transferring it over to mine or videos, I guess. So the easiest thing is for me to just connect you up with Olive. You go there, have yourself a good time, because she's got great suggestions. And so do most of the people who are participating. I think I've followed about 5 different video people who are doing a Nonfiction November, and they're seeing some pretty interesting books come out of it, and a couple that seem to be hot topics for people. I'll talk about that in a second. So the challenge is that you read a minimum of 1 nonfiction book in November, and if you read more, great. There is a book that's a group read along, and it is The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom, like a sweeping broom. And I'm not exactly sure what that's all about. It sounds interesting, but not interesting enough for me to want to do a group read. I've got too many things going on, so maybe next year. Wasn't the best choice for me. Now, the other thing that Olive does is she gives 4-word prompts so that you can try to help sort out what you're going to read. Nonfiction goes all the way from 0 to 1,000 in the library, or beyond. I don't know what number they're at. So, yeah, it's pretty difficult to just narrow it down. So by giving some prompts, it helps trigger some ideas, or you can see how the books that you maybe have on your shelf or are interested in can fit in. It's just a little structuring the device. And so what the prompts are, they are time, buzz, movement, and discovery. So the first one I chose, and I did have to confess that I read this in October because it's a library book and it's due yesterday. So I had to read it early, is A Black Woman's History of the United States, written by Daina, Ramney and Kaylee Nicole Gross. This is published in 2020, and I meant to check up who the publisher is. Beacon Press, Boston. Just as I was getting ready for this video, I happened to check the title page to see who the publisher was. And they have this series going on that might be interesting for those of you who like American history. Books in the Revisioning American History series. A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronsky. A Disability History of the United States by Kim Nielsen. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And An African American and Latinx History of the United States by Paul Ortiz. So those all sound pretty interesting. If they're written in the same kind of structure as this, well, let me just talk about this book, and you'll see what happens if you pick up the others. This is a series of chapters that go from first contact of known Black people, mostly South America, Mexico, South America is where it first happened in the 1600s. And it brings us all the way up to just, what is the last? I think it's in the 1970s, I think. Yes, 1970s is the up to 2000, I guess, where I guess in a way the history of the last 50 years isn't quite so hard to track down. So if you're interested in someone, then it's a little easier to do your research and find out. But these earlier women, well, because it's mostly women, a surprising number of them came over as free women. The slave trade was not really gung-ho at that point. It was more just incidental if you were a slave. It wasn't a deliberate encroachment on North American land to introduce the slave trade, not as an economic force, but you might just be someone who happened to own slaves and decide to be settling and using your slaves as labor or what have you. Quite a number of the early people would be involved in the explorations, acting either as guides or translators or cooks or nurses or what have you on the journeys from, let's just say, well, there were quite a lot. I can't even begin to describe it because that's the kind of detail that goes out of my head. So that was really interesting. I really had no idea that there were that many black women who had arrived on North American shores so early. I was pretty aware of the sort of incursion of white people in North America, but more from a sort of Columbus kind of thing, not all the other intermediate people. There was also a really interesting graphic on how many slave ships traveled across, and the numbers are staggering. What's interesting is that at least 50% of them went to South America as opposed to the United States. So that's just another unexplored story, I'm sure. What's interesting for me in this story, or in this book, is that I haven't seen any kind of research like this done in Canada. I'm sure that we would have had black women coming across on ships. We would have had a number of people coming up through the Boston States, as we sometimes call them here. I'm sure there were, of course, we do know that there were slaves escaping, but I think there probably were people who were also free who traveled up and would have settled. And there is a museum in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, that is the Black History of Nova Scotia, and that's recently opened. But with the pandemic, we were limited. Visits were limited. You could only go in for half an hour, and I just thought that's too long of a drive for too little amount of time. And if the whole museum can be gone through in 30 minutes with a guide, that's how in depth is it? Anyhow, back to the book. There were a couple of things that really intrigued me, and I did decide that I was going to try and follow through, and didn't write them down. But there is a suffragette woman that I'm very interested in reading about, and there is another one who was a writer in the 40s, and there was one other woman that I was quite interested in following up on. There should be something probably in the university libraries as opposed to the public libraries, because these ladies were doing their work pre-1960 for the most part, and 1915 to 1960 was this group of women's work, and they are interesting to me to follow up, which I'll do in the new year. So I found it to be a really interesting book. The structure is quite interesting in that the authors will give a description of what was the experience of black women in general, opening with a personalized story of a specific woman and the facts that were able to be tracked down, and then a couple of other women would be spoken about through the course of the chapter, and how they came together. Not every black woman in the stories that they chose on was a hero. I think there was a murderess in there, and partly to explore the whole area of women who are incarcerated for crimes that they may or may not have committed. There definitely were, in the later chapters, women who did commit crimes. But in the earlier chapters, as we know anything about slavery, we know that women were just accused of anything and everything in order to meet somebody else's needs. They were most of the time quite innocent of what they were accused of, but would suffer way out of proportion to whatever the misdeed allegedly was. So I think it's a really great scan across the histories, but also because they've personalized this, I think that it just makes it that much more absorbable. And I thought there were pictures in here. I was sure there were pictures. Yep, there's a couple of, for instance, there's a lady who is a performer on the vaudeville stages. There were a number of women who were involved in the military. That was also a pretty tough thing to do, to get into the military. And this one is a lady who's may or may not be free, but she's waiting outside of a slave pen in Virginia. In the background, it's just the slave pens were just appalling. This is a really interesting book. I really recommend it. I think that there's a lot to be drawn out of it because they have chosen so many areas of female experience. There's got to be something in here that will speak to you, whether you're interested in science or the military or the arts or just the history in general of the early days. And there's got to be something in this book that you're going to really enjoy. So that was for time. Buzz is a book that I don't have on hand because I read it from the library back in February, and at the time I have done a video of it, but I haven't figured out how to edit it in. So that's next week's project. So I will talk to you about that, hopefully, if all goes well. It is Peace and Good Order by Harold Johnson. And Harold Johnson is Canadian, was a Canadian, what do you call that? What is he? Sorry, I totally blanked on the name for it. Prosecutor, Canadian prosecutor. And he mostly traveled through what at the time would have been the Northwest Territories, but is today known as Iqaluit and Nunavut, which is that big wide band across the top of Canada below the waterline. And he traveled by plane, and the prosecutors and the defenders and everybody, judge, so on, would all travel together on the same plane. And they'd go into these small communities and they would try the cases, quite often not being too interested in the outcomes, in the terms of there wasn't a huge amount of care taken in finding out the evidence. The RCMP was involved, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were involved. They just got their man. They didn't get their evidence. They should have included that in their motto. Anyways, over time, as Harold Johnson is watching this go past for years and years, there's some patterns arising in terms of the evidence that's brought before him, the witnesses, the defendants themselves, the interest or the opportunities for the defenders to do their job well, and none of it's looking good. So as time goes by, he's realizing that this is not working. This is not working at a deep, deep level. It has a lot to do with when you take out someone who, let's just say maybe they stole gas from somebody else and they used it for their snowmobile, for instance. Sort of a cliche moment. But that person would be prosecuted for the stealing of the gas, given a ridiculous amount of time, way above the value of the price of the gas. And that maybe was the fellow who was responsible for doing the hunting for the community. So a lot of the people who would get incarcerated would be operating under the influence of some sort of intoxicant. We're talking particularly about the men at this moment. But when they were sober, they were quite often very instrumental in things like the hunting, the transportation, the mechanics. I mean, you just name all the sort of small things that hold a community together, and everybody had to be good at something somewhere along the way. You may not be doing that while you're intoxicated, repairing a car, I hope, or you might, but either way, if you take that person out of the picture and they're gone for 3-4 years, whatever it is, because we're not talking murder here, we're talking sort of small petty crimes for the most part. you'd be taken away out of your community for so long that the community that depended upon you would start to implode. So there'd be all kind of social causality that would happen with that. And really just, there had to have been a better way to, the judicial system in North America, and I guess in most of the world, is kind of a vengeance-based situation, and we're going to teach that person a lesson. Well, it doesn't work. In my opinion, the prison system does not work. I don't think anybody learns a damn thing except either how to be a better criminal when they get out, or just, they give up. So that's a whole other story. Although Harold Johnson does talk a little bit about it as to what would be opportunities for a judicial system that actually made sense in the lifestyle and in the geography of First Peoples. So the full title of the book is Peace and Good Order, which are actually the beginning words in our Constitution, the case for Indigenous justice in Canada. And one of the reasons Harold Johnson wrote this book is that he says in the blurb that it is his attempt to take responsibility for what he did as a Crown prosecutor. It's by Penguin House, and it was published in 2019. It's short, and it's powerful, and it's bloody good. Now, the reason I kind of caught on to that book is this came out last year, Just Mercy, which is now a movie. The movie will have nothing on the book, I'm convinced. This is so deep and so nuanced. I can't imagine that the movie would do it any justice at all unless it was a miniseries. But this book was incredible, and it is a story of justice and redemption by Bryan Stevenson, and it is taking a hard look at the judicial system, prisons, and so forth in southern U.S. mostly. Louisiana comes up quite often. Anyways, this has been around for 12 months, and if you're interested in Black Lives Matter, the judicial system in the States, justice, injustice, this is top notch. But because it's an American book, I wanted to see if I could find one that was Canadian. Okay, so that was Buzz. Did I say that at the beginning? Maybe not. Buzz is the prompt word for those two books because Black Lives Matter, people of color matter, and the judicial system in both countries is not working. That's my take on it. The next one is Movement. Now, this was kind of funny because I chose Sounds of a Wild Snail eating. There's almost no movement. That snail hardly gets anywhere. Elizabeth Tova Bailey. This has also been spoken about over the course of the year. Quite a lot of people have picked this one up on their list. And it's about a woman who has got some sort of autoimmune problem going on and fatigue, huge amount of fatigue. So she can be quite immobile for long periods of time. And someone brought her a plant that had this little snail on it. And over the months and years, this little snail is given a terrarium to live in. And it's a really nice story in terms of the woman's illness and how she's managing it, how the snail is managing being inside in a plant in a terrarium and then released to the wilds. Born free, slither free. So there's also a huge number of details around the snail's ecosystem, its own body, its own anatomy, and behaviors, animal behavior. You wouldn't think that a snail would elicit a whole lot of behavior, but it does, and is very particular about mating, for instance. The other thing I didn't realize, which is kind of cool, is the slime of the snail is actually, it doesn't really trail behind them. It kind of goes forward, and the snail is traveling on basically a hydroplane. Just the moisture between it and the world is what allows the snail to kind of scoot along on its own terms. So that's my book choice for Movement. Now here's another one, not for Movement, but for the prompt Discovery. And it's one we bought my daughter last year for Christmas, and it is super cool. I do not like water. I like water in a pool. So this is in Oceans Deep by Bill Streever. Courage, Innovation, and Adventures Beneath the Waves. And it really sounded interesting. I was quite, kind of challenged by this one because I'm out of my comfort zone. So it's definitely about discovery because we're under the water. There's lots of reasons to be afraid. And these are people, well, so far it's mostly men who have been working. We start with the caissons at Brooklyn Bridge, and those of you have to dig down so deep in order to put the footings in for a bridge. So you're down below where the pressure is pretty intense, water pressure, air pressure, and when you come up, you get nitrogen poisoning in the bloodstream if you come up too quickly, and that's known as the bends. So this is a look kind of at the world of diving, the research around the toxicity in the blood, the alternative gases, because you use a hydrogen oxygen mix, I think it is, when you are going down in the today we've got the people just have the masks and the tanks on the back, but in the past they'd have those big bubblers. And one of the things that some of these exploration projects, I guess, is how to go deeper. It's surprising how we can go about 100 feet below the water without too much trouble, but the deeper you get, the more dangerous the return is. And what's interesting, they've discovered, I'm only partway through the book, is that if you go down 100 feet, and let's just say you have to go 3 stops and it takes you about 6 hours to come back, there's a certain point that when you go below 100 feet, so if you go down to 1,000 feet, it's still going to only take you about 6 hours to return. And so there's a point where the saturation kind of changes. I guess there's sort of a zero, and so from down below to here, everything's kind of okay, and then from here, this is the danger zone. So I'm at the point where in the book where it's called saturation diving, and this is where, contrary to outer space, where people go up in their satellite things, and it's down below, and they're doing work on what do you call it? Those cables. Oh my God. Oh, those cables that travel across the bottom of the ocean, and all that kind of communication cables and so forth. I'm only partway through this, and I know the challenges for November, but my daughter's going to take the book home, so I'm getting a bit of a head start on Nonfiction November. It's turning into Nonfiction October. I'm really enjoying this, and it's certainly completely out of my normal reading zone, so a lot of discovery going on. One of the things that the project asks us to do is to recommend other books. So I have 3 books. I'll just go them quickly, and I'll link them in the doobly-doo below, so if you're interested. I will also be reading the Penguin book of Mermaids, which is the history of mermaids through literature, art, and myth, and folk tales, and so forth across the world. And this is nonfiction put out by Penguin Classics. The next one I'm going to be reading is Life After Suicide, Finding Courage, Comfort, and Community After Unthinkable Loss by Jennifer Ashton, medical doctor. Suicide's been a bit of a theme in our family. Before the kids were in their mid-teens, between my son and my daughter, they had both encountered friends of friends, families of friends who had to commit suicide. I think there were about 3 individuals who'd chosen that path, and around the same time, I had a friend who committed suicide, and then my son struggled with suicidal thoughts when he was first diagnosed with depression. So really don't know where this book's going to go. It's mostly memoir. The Jennifer Ashton's husband commits suicide completely unexpectedly. She thought everything was fine, and he made that choice. So it's totally memoir. This one I just picked up actually just a couple hours ago. We popped into the library, and it is Fighting for Women's Rights, The Extraordinary Adventures of Anna Leonowens. It's a history biography by Moushumi Chakrabarty. And one of the reasons I picked this up is Anna Leonowens is a figure in Nova Scotia. There's an art gallery. Wasn't she the daughter of Victor Hugo? Have I got that wrong? Maybe I've got the two people mixed up. Anyways, there's the Anna Leonowens Gallery is art gallery connected to the Nova Scotia School of Craft and Design, and part of the graduation process for students is to put on an exhibition. So there's about every 2 weeks. I don't know how things have been going through the pandemic, but every 2 weeks the graduating students will be putting on exhibitions. Alumni get to put on exhibitions, and it's just a really fun little gallery, and it's named after her. I think she was a large part of the funding for that. She's also the governess in the movie The King and I, in case you aren't familiar. That is a really pretty movie. I am sure that looking at it through today's lens, there'd be all kinds of things to critique about it. But if you like a musical and some pretty dancing and Yul Brynner's bald head, that's a good movie. So I'm going to read that one as well in November. Three more recommendations real quick. This is an old one, Salt by Mark Kurlansky. It is the history of salt. It's across the world. I found this interesting, super, super interesting. It talks about different kinds of minerals in the salts, the trade around salt, the uses of salts, how salt sort of manifests itself in the first place. It's really, it's a good one. Now, this one I think I read 2 years ago and just love it. For me, it's a 5-star. The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs, A New History of a Lost World by Steve Brusatte. And, I didn't think I was a dinosaur person. There's been dinosaurs. I still have dinosaurs in the kids' old toy shelves. And this takes you right back. There's been all kinds of modern technology that allows for different kinds of dating, MRIs, all that kind of stuff that can happen. And there's always, the paleontology always is changing as a result of the new technology. So this takes us back and has another look at some of the fossils and some of the decisions that were made in terms of, not really the hierarchy, the lineage, let's call it, the timeline of dinosaurs. And probably, if I'm not mistaken, it goes back to trilobites, probably. I do remember I wanted to reread the first chapter because I didn't quite get what was happening in the first chapter. But for those of you, there are a lot, who are choosing Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, A Braiding Sweetgrass, which I do have, actually. It's up beside the bed, but I've got too many on the go right now. She has another one out that I started with. It's Gathering Moss, A Natural and Cultural History of Mosses. It's really good. Who'd have thunk that you'd be interested in mosses and lichens? I love it. It is the perfect bedtime story. It's just, as her other writing is, it's very considered, very gentle, it's very earth-centric, and she just brings beautiful perspectives to her writing. And really, really loving it. And in fact, there's a whole reading Gathering Moss, as well as the Sound of a Wild Snail. That would make a really interesting pair. Very, very interesting couple of things to join together. Well, that's it for me. I have gone on way too long. I did have 2 other books that are from my book club, but I'll do those next week. So we can look forward to a short discussion of The Marrow Thieves and Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. I hope all your reading dreams and adventures continue to come true. And if you're participating in Nonfiction November, I hope your books are really interesting. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.